Lecture 5, Libertarianism.
Ladies and gentlemen, in the last few lectures, I've talked to you about liberalism. We've seen what liberalism involves, we've seen what some of the different interpretations of it are, we've looked at some of the arguments back and forth between different liberals, and we ended up by taking something of an outside perspective, offering a kind of challenge to liberalism from a conservative perspective. Today we're going to turn to something rather different, namely libertarianism. In the second lecture, I suggested that we might look at these different ideas in politics by way of considering different people who might be together at a dinner party. In that context, I picked various stereotypes. The Northeastern University professor as a welfare liberal, the entrepreneur from Silicon Valley as a classical liberal. If we're trading in stereotypes, one might imagine someone who isn't invited to the dinner party, a computer nerd who worked for the entrepreneur, who's recently left to get involved in a dot-com startup. What might their politics be like? Well, I would guess, stereotypically, it would be libertarian. What is libertarianism all about? First of all, I think it's useful here to recall classical liberalism. What does classical liberalism involve? Well, we explore that in some detail, but one might ask from such a perspective, how much government do we need? Or indeed, do we actually need the state at all? There has indeed been a group of largely American thinkers who've responded to this question by saying we don't actually need much of a state at all, or indeed we don't need any state at all. In the US, a libertarian party was, until Ross Perot and then Ralph Nader's efforts for the Greens in 2000, the third largest US political party. That seems kind of quite impressive, but when you actually think about it, that isn't a kind of big achievement, but at any rate, they're there. And certainly, I think more significantly, there have been public policy institutes, such as, say, the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C., which take a broadly libertarian perspective on things and are quite influential. And more generally, there is a network of educational and public policy institutions which are quite widespread, indeed right across the globe, which offer a libertarian approach to issues in public policy. The ideas involved in libertarianism are striking in themselves. They also challenge in quite interesting ways our usual ways of thinking. What I'll do in this lecture is to present these ideas and then discuss some criticism of them. What is libertarianism all about? Recall Adam Smith's ideas about markets and coordination that we talked about in the second lecture, and also John Locke's ideas about rights. Libertarianism links these things together in the following way. First of all, individual interaction in market settings is typically consensual and it's voluntary. There isn't coercion. In a market transaction, everyone expects to and typically does gain from interaction. Before this lecture, I had lunch at a local diner. The Korean guy who runs it was very happy to take my money and to give me spaghetti and meatballs in return. I was very happy to have the spaghetti and meatballs and to give him the money in return. Both of us reckoned that we were getting a good deal. I preferred the meatballs and spaghetti, he preferred the money. Clearly, though, for this kind of thing to work, you need a moral and legal framework. I mean, just by people pursuing their self-interest, you might get one person simply robbing another, which wouldn't work. In terms of a legal and moral framework, libertarians say, look, actually this is provided by Lockean ideas about moral rights, including property rights, understood as being something that exists prior to the existence of government, not as a creation of government, but something that, in a sense, people can understand as morally appropriate and on the basis of which they can conduct themselves. Some libertarians, it might be said, argue in utilitarian rather than rights-based terms. You may recall in this context the discussion of John Stuart Mill in the second lecture, who argued to liberal conclusions on a utilitarian basis. Some libertarians argue in that kind of manner. For the libertarian, a key thing is to contrast voluntary transactions with coercion, where they associate coercion particularly with the state. Why, you might say, do they take such a view about government and the state? Well, one cut on it that they offer is that they see government as typically having originated by force. For example, way back in history, historical conquest, particularly of peaceful farmers by herdsmen who sweep down from the hills and take their stuff from them. To get a kind of concrete picture of this, you might think, well, who, say, are the British aristocracy? Well, by and large, the British aristocracy were people whose ancestors helped kings take land away from other people, or did favours for them, sometimes unmentionable, and so on. It's well worth remembering this next time some member of the British aristocracy comes to the US and sort of advertises diets and so on television. I mean, if you think of this not necessarily as being someone who's all that respectable, but basically someone whose ancestors were good at ganging up and robbing other people, then you get roughly the correct picture from a libertarian perspective. Governments, though, are seen by libertarians not just as something that originated in this manner, but also as something that is still exploitative in its character. How? Well, basically, from a libertarian perspective, all kinds of people make a pretty good living by working for government. Okay? And other people get resources from the government for all kinds of purposes, education included. And this, and from the libertarian's point of view, this is crucial, this stuff is obtained by taxation, which at bottom is a product of coercion. Let me explain how this works, because in this context, libertarians may well refer to one of two rather different sets of ideas. One slightly unusual but kind of interesting set of ideas is sometimes referred to as classical liberal class theory. What's it all about? Well, it was some ideas developed by some early 19th century French theorists, and it was then revived in the 20th century by an American libertarian theorist called Murray Rothbard. What you do from this perspective, in order to understand really how the world works, is to contrast those who get their income by way of exchange, who essentially get stuff that they want by giving other people things in return, and you contrast that with those people who depend ultimately on taxation for it. And the argument is that this is important in terms of affecting people's attitudes. Take two different college professors, both of them whom may well think, first, that they are not paid enough, and second, that more money should be spent on education. If one of them is working completely in the private sector, the only way to get more resources is basically to make a better product that people are willing to pay more for. If someone is working for a state university, at bottom, they will realize that their income actually comes from the state. And so what they want to do is to ask the state really to raise more income, which means in the end asking for an increase in taxes. And that, at the end of the day, is ultimately extracted from other people by force. And if you're skeptical about that, try, next time you have to do a tax return, simply writing no across the form and sending it off to the IRS and see what happens. Just an experiment in politics, as it were. The other line of argument is one which is often termed public choice theory. It's been developed by some American economists, Gordon Tullock and James Buchanan, who in particular got a Nobel Prize in economics for his work in this area. What you get from this perspective is really the notion that those in government, politicians and bureaucrats, pursue their own interests. Buchanan will often say, look, you're dealing here with the same people who are shopping when they're shopping for food to try and get the best deal that they can, or trying to get the best return on their savings, and so on. You may say, okay, but, why is that a big deal? Well, what he and other people stressing this approach want to emphasize is that many people had written just as if government simply acts in the interests of the public, that government is seen as a kind of all-powerful agency which is well-intentioned and just does the right thing, does what people want. And the public choice theorists say, no, what you need to do rather is to see people in government and people connected with government as acting to further their own interests, rather than just doing the right thing. People following out their own interests, and that, in a sense, is being responsible for what government does. Some people might say, well, look, okay, but this is sort of crazy. Surely government provides us with all kinds of useful services. Libertarians will say, yeah, sure, so it does. but so does the mafia. And the problem about both of them is, first of all, you don't get any real say in terms of what you're given, and second, that you